Very good.
Showtime.
Okay.
Showtime.
We'll get started. Welcome to the HKS Energy Policy Seminar. I'm Joe Aldy, and I'll serve as the host today. Thanks to everybody for joining us in the room. Thanks to our students for coming back on time from spring break. Not all of your classmates have. We are also thrilled to have so many friends and alumni and colleagues joining us on Zoom in our hybrid format. Welcome. We're thrilled to have with us today Dr. Richard Sandor. I could spend the rest of our time going through Richard's bio here, but let me just hit on a few of the high points. He's currently the CEO of Environmental Financial Products and the Aaron Director, Lecturer in Law and Economics at the University of Chicago Law School. He's widely known as a pioneer in financial futures and environmental finance. His work has been closely associated with the development of interest rate futures, the Chicago Climate Exchange, and market-based approaches to environmental protection that we'll spend some time getting into in our conversation here today. He has been sought around the world for his insights and guidance on the design of markets for addressing environmental problems. And he joins us today in connection with his new book, co-authored with Paula DiPerna, Carbon Hunters, Reflections and Forecasts of Climate Markets. Richard, welcome to the Energy Policy Seminar.
Joe, it's great to be here with you.
So let's start sort of big picture. Why markets to tackle environmental problems?
Well, I think that as we spoke earlier, up until Ronald Coase, and to speak some economics, Pigou thought that you could only do things by command and control, taxes or subsidies. And in an article that he wrote in 1960, for which he won the Nobel Prize, he said markets could be used effectively to deal with externalities. And I was inspired by him. He subsequently became a friend, and I sought his guidance. He eventually was read by a guy by the name of Joe Dales, who came up to trading rights to emit. And I thought it was a natural when I first was exposed to environmental issues in the late 80s, when somebody approached me from Washington and said, we've got an acid rain problem in the United States, and do you think markets could be used to solve the problem?
Okay, so let's get to acid rain in a little bit, but first let's sort of talk about like what we need for these markets to function well. You mentioned the work of Ronald Coase. You know, he indicated the importance of well-defined property rights. What does that actually mean when we think about pollution, whether it's carbon dioxide or sulfur dioxide or something else? What's the well-defined property right that serves as that sort of key foundational ingredient to well-functioning markets?
Right. As all of you know, nobody owns the commons per se. Nobody owns the air. Nobody owns water. Nobody owns biodiversity. And therefore, it leads to market failures, because if people optimize, they often pollute and don't account for marginal social costs. So you've got to invent a right to use something and make it scarce. And once you make that scarce by having a limited right to use, then markets come about. And I'll give you, because you fed me a soft one, I'll give you a very easy thing that I use when I teach, and I think is very useful. And I use the word cited, okay? And the first S for cited is scarcity. And once you have scarcity, we know as economists, you need to make choices, right? So that's the C. After you make choices, you have to build mechanisms to make sure that there's optimization. That is, you reduce the pollution at a cost that is affordable or minimized. So scarcity, choice, I did. If you are in the business of financial innovation, you've got to define institutions that have, for I, incentives, for T, minimum transaction costs, for E, expectations, and D, diversification. And if you think of that as a step, everything else that you come up is going to fall into transactions costs, incentives, expectations, diversifications, and that's really all you need to know. It isn't very more complex than that.
So when we think about then the design of well-functioning markets, there's got to be this role that's played to ensure that there's scarcity in this right to pollute. We can think about that as kind of the initial role of the state. EPA, for example, as we'll talk about in a moment, the SO2 set an aggregate cap on emissions. But then there's a key role for the private sector through financial innovation to develop products that enables the players in the market to understand, process information, and decide how to engage and participate in those markets. Describe a little bit about some of your work in financial innovation.
Let's talk, if we can, throw up slide 5 on, I think, on cost of building a market, because I think it really frames the answer that you had. No, keep going. There you go. Okay. If you take a look at that cited and try to figure out things, this is the way I think you should think and the way I think about markets. And then we can discuss which of these is public and which is private. And I'll make the case, Joe, that even if you're doing private markets, you need to follow this. And it's a stretch, but you'll like it. Okay. So you have enabling, and that's legislative, right? You need to implement the legislative, and that you need regulatory. After you have an enabling and you have a regulatory framework, which give you property rights, incentives, you've got to build the institutions, which are exchanges, and you have to build the stakeholders' engagement in that: accountants, lawyers, back office, matching engines, technologies, all of those. And then you have to design the contract. And that is where the private sector really comes in, because we invented a bond futures, which was a hypothetical 20-year bond that didn't exist, and invented a concept called cheapest to deliver, which gave optionality, which created micro liquidity because people valued options differently. So the contract writing is very critical. Let me quickly get into that, because part of what I learned from Hendrik Houtacker, who was a great economist here at Harvard. And how do you get it right? And you can say, that's easy. I just say, if you're going to deliver a bond, you deliver a bond. If you're going to deliver a piece of plywood, you deliver a piece of plywood. The entire world functions and makes decisions about the most important food, wheat, based on a contract in Chicago. Houtacker dealt with this because how do you homogenize it? You will be very interested to learn that the Chicago wheat contract, which is about 400 million bushels, okay, of a $2 billion U.S. crop, is the pricing basis for American wheat and world wheat, which is 30 billion. So how do you find 400 million, okay, very tiny fraction, 1-2% of the world supply, and pick it correctly so that you can price wheat in Hamburg and Beijing? Because when you look at the Chicago price, let's say it's $5. If you want to know the price in Hamburg, you add to it the cost of loading the elevator onto the barge, barging it down to Mississippi, putting it in the elevator in Mississippi, getting barge freight to Rotterdam, unloading it in Rotterdam, railing it to Hamburg, and you get the price of wheat in Germany from a crop that's only 2% of the world's price. So it's not like this contract writing is trivial. And that, to answer your question, is where does the private sector come in the institutions and the contract details? Because we don't trade wheat or corn or soybeans or bonds or S&P 500 even. Right. How do you get an index that reflects how do you commoditize something is the financial innovative art in the whole environmental space.
How does creating a contract, taking some of these insights from agricultural commodities where we saw this initial wave of innovation, how do we take those insights to the environmental realm that then unlocks the market, unlocks financing that actually helps drive resources towards reducing pollution?
Perfect example is carbon. I mean, we can get back to sulfur, but carbon is 6 gases. Each has a weight. Do you trade carbon only from coal or fossil fuels? Do you create carbon produced by etching chips? Do you take carbon produced by refrigerants? Do you take carbon that goes up in the air only? Or do you take carbon that is a negative emission that you bury in a tree or in the roots of a plant or in the ocean or in a cavern in Louisiana? So there's not just carbon. And do you treat them differently? And what kind of incentives do you create for a farmer and for somebody who's reforesting an Amazon rainforest? And then how do you try to accommodate the biodiversity gains that come with that? And how do you price those? So while you think you buy and sell NVIDIA or Meta, and it's a simple decision, Joe, you asked the $1 million question, how do you really financially innovate? And it's not like you trade a simple stock.
So let's talk about how we took some of the ideas, as you noted, some of the academic pioneers. You began your career at the School of Business at the University of California, Berkeley.
Teaching, yeah.
And teaching. And then you found yourself attracted to Chicago. Go to Chicago Board of Trade, chief economist, played a number of roles there at the Chicago Board of Trade. We then fast forward to when you started to become a tree hugger. You got to ask questions about, like, we've got this acid rain problem, and how can we think about leveraging potential market innovations to tackle this? So describe a little bit about how we decided to design in legislation, to use your first category here, the acid rain program in the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, and how that led to then some of the engagement with the Chicago Board of Trade when we launched those markets.
Great question. I first have to give a shout out. I'm 800 years old, and so I went to school with a guy by the name of John Goldstein, who was a tree hugger, and John did his PhD thesis on draining, marshes for ducks, and he got his claws into me and said, "You gotta study environment." I said, "John, leave me alone. I don't have time for all of this." And he and I remained friends for his entire life. And he said, "Do that." And I said, "Okay, John, leave me alone." Then in 1989,
Right.
I get approached by a group called the Coalition for Acid Rain Equity, and it's a lobbying group. And when you pass flue gas through a lime sludge, it takes the sulfur out. These guys were in the business of mining lime. So they were in love with the legislation. They could sell a lot of lime to suck the sulfur out of it. So they said to me, "Hey, do you think you would be interested in promoting a program that has a market-based solution?" And I'm thinking of COAS and all of the stuff I had done. And I said, yeah. They say, "Yeah, well, you commoditize interest rates. Can you commoditize air?" And I said, "Sure. As a matter of fact, that may be easier." And so they said, "Write a paper." I wrote a paper, and I said, "Look, if you take a look at 18 million tons, and I'm going to get back to a central reference here, you get the amount of emissions put into the air annually, which is the size of the wheat crop." And I said, "It's got the scale to develop a spot market and a futures market. So it really promises to be a very big success." Wrote the paper, walked, as you well know, Joe, walked the halls of Congress, visited with senators, advocated for the bill, and the bill was passed. I'm concomitantly on the board of directors of the Board of Trade. I get on the board, have a meeting. I said, "Hey, guys, I got something crazy, and they knew that I had often had perverse ideas, and they said, "What is it?" I said, "Let's set up something called the Clean Air Committee." And everybody looked at me like, "What, are you kidding?" And so we formed a Clean Air Committee to explore. One of the guys on the board was Jim Thompson, who was then governor, and
Governor of Illinois.
Governor of Illinois. And Jim says, "I want to be on the committee," and we went. He said, "What do you need to do?" I said, "Well, the act has got some real problems." And he said, "What's the problem?" And I said, "The problem is, in this design, I couldn't get it in, my input, but you'll never get it to trade because there's asymmetric information. Only the utilities know what they pollute, and no speculator is going to buy or trade this commodity because, unlike wheat or corn or bonds, there's no supply that's publicly available." So he said, "Oh, we could fix that." And I said, "How?" He said, Well, I know all of these Republicans. He said, I'm a Republican. Let's go to Washington. We'll go see Bill Riley. He's an old friend. And then we'll see, who's then Michael Boskin. He said, I got a bunch of these Republicans I can do. And then there's a lot of the Republicans that might be very interested in this because they like clean air and there's a guns and rods particular that are very pro-environmental. So we went to Washington, said to Bill, it's not going to work. He said, that's okay. I didn't know, but there's something called a technical correction. So you can add to an act stuff that the legislators forgot. So we put in a technical correction, slammed the condition, a CEM, a continuous emission monitor, onto the stack. Bill said, would you serve on the Acid Rain Advisory Committee? Because there was a lot of people who were well-meaning, but they didn't know what a QSIP number was, and they didn't know what a registry was. And there was a great head of the EPA at that time who was quite a good guy. And so we worked with him, and then we had a provision in the act that there would be a public dissemination of prices through an auction. And excuse me, the Board of Trade decided to offer its services on a pro bono basis and conducted the auction.
Right. Let's get to that in a moment. A couple of quick things I'd like to jump in on here. Continuous emission monitors meant we could get information on 15-minute intervals on what's going out of the smokestack of these power plants. So we knew with very high frequency data how much sulfur dioxide. Also, interestingly, because of the technology used, how much carbon dioxide is going through those smokestacks, getting reported, I think, in a sense, almost instantaneously. You could actually get access to these data publicly, usually in a lag of like a few weeks or a month. So
Right.
like really quick turnaround on when you could see the data. If you ever want to do research in this space, it's a great wealth of data to work with to really understand the emissions of the power plants. But it then meant that everybody knew what's coming out of the smokestacks in terms of the sulfur dioxide pollution of all the plants participating in this program. You mentioned QSIP. I don't know if everyone here knows about QSIP, but it helps us uniquely identify a paper associated with a company, so that when I'm buying or selling a piece of paper for that company, I actually know that I've got the unique version of that, not some duplicate. But why in general is having some of this and having a registry, these things that are like fundamental to well-functioning financial markets, why is that important in the trading of allowances for S&P?
We get back to transactions costs and David Ricardo, because if the gains from trade are less than the cost of a transaction, you don't trade, right? It's that simple.
So it's this kind of standardization that's driving down the cost of finding a buyer and a seller so that they can then undertake the transaction and actually then realize those gains.
Absolutely. So it gets back to cited and the transactions costs and the incentives.
So EPA then is creating this program to limit the total amount of SO2 to be emitted. They've identified all these power plants that over two phases. One, the big set of power plants in 1995, second set of kind of smaller facilities coming online in 2000. They are reporting their emissions to these continuous emission monitors. They have to surrender each year emission allowances, that right to emit, to cover those emissions. And so that we can start to learn about what's really on the margin, the cost of reducing pollution, we have this auction.
The auction is conducted in 1993. Ronald Coase is there to keynote the auction. Is a great picture of him. I think it might be in the book, or I don't know, but he's there to ring the bell, like you see at the New York Stock Exchange. And I think, Joe, it was very important to have an academic imprimatur, you know, to suggest this wasn't a game. Now, one thing that's important, I think, for everybody to realize is why markets and what is cap and trade and how do you understand it? So there was actually a woman in upstate New York who had Glen Falls, who had a fifth grade class that she wanted to teach about acid rain because it was produced in Ohio, went to New York, came down, and she said to kids, you know, you can encourage people by subsidizing the capture or removal of SO2, or you could just legislate a cap. And she said, then there's trading, and they didn't understand it. So what she did was give out, there were 30 kids in the class, and give out 25 rights to chew gum in the class, and created a property right, a chewing gum right for an hour. And then if some kid wanted to chew for 2 hours, they could buy the right from another kid. So she actually then reduced it to 20.
Okay.
And they got the idea of cap and trade and how effective trading was. She also, when asked to come up with what these kids could do, she said, let's take the revenue from the chewing gum permits and go buy an acid rain permit and give it to the American Lung Association. Okay. So they came to Chicago. I don't know, she must be, she's going to be president of the United States. I don't know, she was in the 5th grade then, or 11 years old, leading the auction. Right. And she came, and the ironical part is that class paid, I think, close to the lowest price on record for buying an acid rain.
Well, that you know, when we think about the some of the lessons from SO2, two of the key outcomes. One, we started learning cutting emissions from SO2 were cheaper than people thought. The allowance prices were clearing in the market. There was that initial auction, and then the brokered transactions were much lower than what people expected, reflecting some of the great appeal of a market-based approach, because you're leveraging that incentive for firms to be as creative as possible to find low-cost ways of reducing pollution. And so it was a lot lower than what was the kind of people assuming coming out of the engineering models that had been developed in the 1980s. And the other then is we were incredibly successful in improving the quality of the
Maybe let's put the maps up, which
I think it's maybe the first one.
The first one.
There we go.
Maybe this is the most successful environmental program in history. Okay, we went from 18 million tons to 3 million tons. We produce anywhere from 40 to 50 billion dollars a year and reduce or 150 billion, so 50 to 100 billion, nobody knows. But let's say
like public health benefits.
Like public health from reduced lung disease, 37,000 people a year don't die, workers' days, productivity lost, all in, and the cost is 2-3 billion. So 40 to 1 conservatively costs relative to benefits. You change the entire landscape of upstate New York. You deacidified rivers, you had foliage, and all done within 4 or 5 years of the program, even though it had a 15-year life. And I mean, wow.
Yeah. So we have this. I believe our colleague and your friend Professor Stevens called it kind of the grand policy experiment.
Yes.
In one of his papers. So we have this policy experiment and learn about the potential for emissions trading to deliver important environmental improvement at lower cost. And people say, maybe we can take this to address climate change. We've got an evolving politics in Washington in the mid to late 1990s. You described a time that for like some of our students, it may be difficult for them to fully reconcile. You're working with Republicans championing an environmental policy, but that was very much the case with the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. I sometimes say like back then it was more as much regional as it was partisan when we sort of thought about environmental issues. We don't have action legislatively on climate, but then you decide to pull together a number of companies to launch the Chicago Climate Exchange. Describe for us a little bit about this experiment, the Chicago Climate Exchange.
Yeah, I get nothing is happening, Joe, and I'm a restless human being. My wife and daughter can tell you that. 93 comes, 94 comes, 95 comes. I meet a guy by the name of Maurice Strong, and we talk, and then Professor Aldy was talking about a panel that I was on with Bob Stavins, who was an environmental hero, and Al Gore back in 97. We go there, nothing is happening. And so, excuse me, I say to a few colleagues, why don't we do this voluntarily? Why don't we just get a number of companies to agree to take a legally binding reduction in emissions and create a club, an exchange, where people will voluntarily take a reduction. So how do you do that? Most importantly, how do you get people to do it with no law?
Right.
Can we put those four squares?
Yeah, you had legislation and regulatory two of your buckets here.
Okay,
so you're now the legislator.
Now here we go. I'm the legislator. So I get on a plane. I'm like a lounge act in Las Vegas. I'm out there. I'm visiting 10 companies a month, literally for a year. I'm in Louisiana. I'm eating barbecue in every southern place you can imagine. I'm in the West Coast. I'm in the Pacific. I am groveling. My knees are braided from crawling. And I'm asking people, will you commit to being in this design phase? And I know you got to do this because I've been working in exchanges for 50 years, and I know there's something that isn't identified in the literature, but I think you'll understand it, that there's a mutual endowment effect, that people like to be part of a group that's affecting changes. Harvard alumni, members of the New York Stock Exchange. So I say there's a mutual endowment effect. I know you can't find it in economics, but I know if I can get the right people, I'm going to get it. But you have to do it slowly. So they sign a commitment letter. The commitment letter says, of the 112 I visited, I find 27 brave souls. And they sign a letter that says nothing, but helps to build the mutual endowment effect. It says, I will participate in designing this exchange and will join if and only if it satisfies every goal my company wants. So it is a promise to do nothing, but it starts to build the spirit.
Mm-hmm.
We convene them and we divide them into manufacturing, power, forest products. And we ask them all to set a baseline legislation
Mm-hmm.
and set a reduction schedule. Forest products, they kind of fill into manufacturing. We get it to 2, and we produce what is called, not the Clean Air Act, but you got to name something. Like the French know that, you know, with wines and things like that. So we call it not the Kyoto Protocol, we call it the Chicago Accord. Okay, and that has got 17 pages as opposed to the Clean Air Act, which has 984, or Waxman-Markey with 2,000. So with 17 pages, we get the deal done.
Right.
Now we have the legislation. Right. Now the problem is, how do we regulate it and make sure people do it? So exchanges have standard functionality. They have business compliance committees, which stop manipulation. They have actual compliance committees that deal with, did you achieve your goal? Did you report it? Etc. And how do you build on this? And how do you get people to participate? So we're running a parallel track, and you need a couple of key players to be serious. And so we end up getting Bill Ford to approve it. He's got an economist, by the way, who Larry Bacco knows, who also lives in Sarasota, by the name of Marty Zimmerman. He's a PhD economist. He gets it. Mm-hmm. We get DuPont in. Then we get American Electric Power. Then we get International Paper. Now, all of a sudden, we've got 4 of the top Fortune 100 companies, lead names, and we go back and forth. Nobody wants to jump into the pool at a different time. I said, come on, guys, hold hands. You know, it's a cold pool, but let's jump in together. So they jump in together, and then the regulatory piece comes. I call up FINRA, and FINRA, for those of you who don't know, is the self-regulatory body for the securities industry. So they audit Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan. And I say to the woman who runs it, a woman by the name of Mary Shapiro, Mary, you and I have been friends for 30 years, and I got a favor to do. You're going to find this very peculiar. I'm not regulated, but I want to be regulated. I want you, under a commercial contract, to audit Ford Motor Company's environmental emissions, and I'll give you the forms. If they use this kind of fossil fuel, I'll tell you how much carbon, and you do a financial audit of them, because most of these are public companies, and the power of the pulpit is so strong. If FINRA is investigating somebody for non-compliance, nobody is going to be non-compliant, because the stock will go down 10% and they'll lose billions of dollars. And this is a second-order way to get at it. She agrees. We eventually end up with 108 emitters, 300 non. We get 25% of the power sector. We get IBM. We get Intel. We get Rolls-Royce. We get Wisconsin Electric, and we build a group of emitters, 108 that are the size of Germany, all with no legislation. Now, we build the institution. How do you build the institution? You grovel for money. You develop a two, you get lucky along the way. The luck comes and you run into a faith-based investor, the Jesuits of Santa Clara, and this is really a tough one, guys. You know, when you get $1 million from the Jesuits, you really want to be careful because you know who they report to. So I'm pretty damn nervous in this time, and Father Francis would call, and my secretary, Marilyn Grace, who is a very devout woman, would come in and say, Father Francis is on the phone. And you pick up the phone and you say, hello, Father. And he says, how are you, Richard? And then you get from him a line you never want to hear from a priest. Richard, how's your burn rate? And I said, we're burning a lot of money, Father. He said, are you signing any new members? A couple, Father.
The business acumen here, the father is impressive.
The father is really a very smart guy, and so the father, after about 3 or 4 discouraging remarks from me, the father ends the conversation with, "You never hear this on Wall Street." Says to me, "I pray for you every night, Richard." And so we get it off the ground. We then find a very unique way. I'll come back, Joe, if you would ever have me, because the financing of this is really unique. We take it public at £1 a share. Dear Lord, thank you. Father, we sell it to ICE, the owner of the New York Stock Exchange, for £7.50. All of this is made possible by the Joyce Foundation and Paula DiPerna. And this says I mean we, and we'll name the individuals. But Paula was there, and she was president of the Joyce Foundation. We got a grant from them for $1 million. Joe, we didn't have to, but we gave them that in shares. So they made a ton of money on the investment in us, even though there was no bargain. And we then went around, and we had opened up an exchange in Europe, which is now the largest exchange in the world. We opened up one in China, which is still a work in progress. And several of my key lieutenants went on to found Incubex. And let me throw one thing up on the board, if we could, slide 8. Because I think it's very important, particularly in today's world. There is no law in the United States causing the reduction of emissions. There has perhaps never been a less welcome world for environmental economics. I'm a student of markets. No laws, federal, but there are states and there are regions. And the punchline is, through state, regional, and voluntary efforts, the open interest, that is the number of contracts to buy and sell for future delivery, carbon rights, renewable energy rights, etc., is bigger than gold. Okay, let me say this again. In a world where there is no federal legislation, private exchanges and markets working with states and with regions have developed markets that are bigger than gold. So perception and reality, these are far from dead.
Right.
There's a fire really burning in this country at the local level.
So I want to follow up on that. I want to note two things real quick for the audience. I'm going to go to questions from you in just a moment. I also want to note, especially for our students, Richard is generous enough to have brought a few books. So on your way out, please grab a copy of his book, Carbon Hunters, when you leave. Talking about how big the market is getting, the single biggest source of emissions globally right now, emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, is China. An economy that has grown incredibly over the last 3 decades. When I first started working on this issue, US emissions of carbon dioxide annually were about double those of China. That position has reversed, and now China's emissions are more than double those of the United States. China is moving forward with using markets. They have cap and trade. They started with pilots with some of the big cities and provinces, expanded to the power sector, now expanding more going forward. Tell us a little bit, you've been doing some work in China where you see how they're moving forward and applying pollution markets and those insights and how that's helping to drive decarbonization there.
I think we again have to not focus on Washington, D.C., and look at the states and look at foreign countries to all get an idea. And China, Professor Aldy nails it, because if we take a look at slide 4, China is 30-40% bigger than the US and the EU combined. So what we do is spitting in the ocean compared to, we could cut by 20% tomorrow, and China's opening up 48 coal-fired plants a year, one every 10 days. So the key is, in 2006, we got invited to the UN, gave a talk there, ran into the representative, hired an investment banker, again, went all over the country, including to Tianjin, which is a suburb of Beijing with 18 million people. And we went down to Tianjin, talked the government of Tianjin, and mayors are like CEOs in China, as you know, and talked to him, and PetroChina, the biggest company in China, is forming the Tianjin Climate Exchange. It was the first climate exchange in China. We traded SO2 as the first trade because it was a real smog emitter. We continued to be there. I was honored to be appointed by the Fudan University because they work with the Shanghai Energy and Environmental. The government decides where markets are going to be, so they decided the carbon market would be in Shanghai and the futures market would be in Guangdong. They continue to go. They had a pilot program. They traded emission intensity, which is the amount of carbon per ton of steel or aluminum. They just switched 4 weeks ago. Among these book tours, and my wife Ellen and I were 18 months ago, were up at Tsinghua University to give a talk there. And the book hadn't been published. And I just did a major talk at the biggest group there. This is anecdotal, but it would be surprising if the Chinese government accidentally invited somebody to talk at key conferences unless there was something afoot. And we said, what you need to do is you have set 2030 as peak carbon. You need to announce a market in 27 or 28, like the sulfur market, in anticipation, and the job will start getting done. So my hope is they will do like they do everything else. They will study it, study it, study it, no action, study it, study it, study it, no action. And then all of a sudden, with a 5 million ton baseline, they will be the largest carbon market in the world and will be a world leader in that area. Don't count it out, because what they do is execute on a massive scale once they approve an idea.
Right. My last question for you, and then we'll go to the audience. Looking forward, right now, globally, about 30% of the world's emissions of greenhouse gases are covered by either markets, cap and trade programs, emission trading systems, or carbon tax. That means about a little bit more than 2/3 of the world's emissions are not. What's sort of the one or two pieces of advice you would give to a policymaker thinking about designing and implementing carbon markets in their jurisdictions in the future?
I think it's very important in the design to focus, okay, and to remember or think of what Napoleon said, okay, when he was unhappy with his generals in Austria. He called them in and he said, when I said take Vienna, I meant take Vienna, not Salzburg, not the suburbs, not anything like that. The job is to reduce CO2 emissions at the lowest possible costs. Do not bring important but less relevant issues like millennium goals, poverty, etc., because if you successfully reduce the carbon emissions, the spillover benefits are enormous. So the Wright brothers didn't invent the 777 as the first plane. They flew the sucker for 60 seconds. It didn't have seat belts. There were no clearly marked exit doors, okay? They produced a model. And for those of us who are in financial innovation, the job, as Joe has been in Washington, the job is to get a good solution, not a perfect solution, but get a plane that flies, that proves the concept that you can get to a better world through market-based solutions to environmental challenges.
Great. Thanks. We'll open it up to questions from the audience. Please identify yourself. And as a reminder, questions are a sentence that ends with a question mark.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Willow Fortunoff. I'm a second year MPP student, and I really appreciated your quote about the fire burning at the local level, as that's great to hear. And I wanted to ask you about the relationship between subnational carbon pricing in the US and national action, given that there's no sign of a national carbon price in the next few years. And so in your view, are these subnational carbon prices, like in California and in the Reggie market, are they precursors or perhaps substitutes in your perspective for national carbon price down the line, if that seems feasible?
Great question. I think this is, it is like Pirandello, the great Italian author. This is 6 characters in search of an author. Okay, we know what the players are, and these sub-markets, single state markets, state of Washington, state of California, regional markets, RGGI, multinational markets, Europe, they are beginning to define the bounds of carbon pricing and where it is. And think of it as a journey towards it, and it's a price signal. It took 50 years for that little soft red wheat contract to become the bellwether for it. Now we're going to be talking about, like in wheat basis, it'll be wherever that market ends, maybe at ICE, which runs Europe, it's going to be, oh, I'll sell you carbon in Kazakhstan at 30 under the ETS in Europe. Or I'll buy it in Beijing at 10 under, because now we have a CBAM, a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is now going to feed Chinese reductions into Europe. So I suspect that the EU ETS, and with the addition of CORSIA and transportation credits, that we are on a journey, perhaps as little as 3, 4, 5 years, that will end up with a international carbon price, just like bread wheat in Chicago. Remember, it's bread wheat. It's not bread wheat, it's cookie wheat. There's 400 million bushels. You price bread around the world, you price pasta, you price Chinese noodles, all on the cost of cookies in Chicago, right? You just need a bellwether, which is the basis for other pricing. So what you implied at the end is we're on the way. I don't know what it is, but right now, I know it's 30 bid at $80 a ton, right now. Give me next year to see where the CORSIA trades.
This is for the aviation.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So we have, under the International Civil Aviation Organization, we're transitioning from kind of these voluntary aims for reducing emissions of airlines to what will become binding goals for those airlines.
Yes.
I'm curious to see how that plays out too.
So that is going to feed your question, next steps.
Other questions?
Hi, my name is Alvaro. Thank you so much for coming here. I find really interesting what you were saying, that the private sector is key in order to fight climate change and reducing emissions. What will be your view, and how can we also try to address and incentivize private sector to continue on this fight when right now legislation and political leadership is pointing to a different way right now?
I think you have to take a look at military history. You're not going to win that fight at the federal level. We've been trying for 20 years. God knows there's carbon hunters here at Harvard. I got to give them a shout out, and Rob Stavin certainly, and Joe. Larry Bacow was president of Tufts University when they joined the Chicago Climate Exchange. That we keep on putting all this effort to changing Washington when we need to look at seatbelt models where it was all grounds up. I think the resources are infinitely better spent working at the state and local level and reconstituting voluntary markets and working with China than it is to try to, and both Professor Aldy and I and Rob lived through something called Waxman-Markey, and I don't want to get into that, but we had an 1,800-page bill that had been vetted, that included credits from CCX, that had gone through everything in the world. And it looks like what's going on in Atlanta's airport today and trying to get it through the Senate. It was just a no-go. So my advice to you is don't fight. You know, you got to go at the flank. You can't go at the center. And the flank is, in this case, voluntary city, local, state markets. This is how the Chicago Board of Trade started. It is the way the New York Stock Exchange started. That there is, and I have been at the University of Chicago, I've been at Arizona State, I've been at Northwestern and DePaul and here at Harvard. There is a will in this country, particularly by people like you that want to affect change. Save the energy for local. Didn't Tip O'Neill say something like that?
All politics is local. our former representative. So I've got a question for you. I want to follow up on this about voluntary carbon markets. We see a lot of companies out there buying offset credits in the voluntary market. It's very different than the voluntary market you constructed, the Chicago Climate Exchange. What are your thoughts about what works and what needs improvement in the voluntary carbon market today?
I think the voluntary carbon market is making great progress in registering and standardizing.
Okay.
I don't think that they have enough teeth to really do anything. Why we succeeded was nobody messed around, okay? We had a board that had Christy Todd Whitman. We had people like Jim Thompson. We had the mayor of the city of Chicago. We had cities like Oakland and Berkeley and things of this nature. And so I think that teeth, compliance, and one of the key things was what we did with fines on a technical note, and what we do in Chicago with that cookie wheat contract, that's the world thing, is we create compliance goals and powers by the members that are, listen carefully, constructively ambiguous. Okay, what do I mean by that? If you say you don't comply and you're going to charge a fine of $30 a ton, and they produce 20,000 tons, and they don't get to their target, they know they get fined by $60,000. Then we know as economists, they go back and they say, can I make more by violating the rule than $60,000? And if I can, then I violate the rule, right? And if it's less, then I comply. So the idea of commodity markets is to be ambiguous and say, we're not going to tell you what the fine is. Okay, you're going to be subject to a business conduct and a compliance committee. And by the way, we are going to fine you whatever we please. It could be $5 million if you're willfully, maliciously not complying, or if you have a 23-year-old clerk that made an error, we're going to fine you $10. So constructively ambiguous penalties drove a lot of our success because nobody, it was also a challenge to get people to agree to that.
Right.
But we had the head of Amtrak, who was a member, chair that committee. There were good-hearted people who wanted to work with people. We called people months in advance and said, you know, you're getting near. You know, we were careful to treat them as not regulated versus regular. This was what I call that mutual endowment effect, okay? We were all in it together.
Great. We have time for one more question. Okay, so then I have one more question before we wrap up. One piece of advice for our students who are trying to think about what they can do when they leave Harvard and go out and try to drive change in addressing climate change.
I just wish I was your age, all of you, because I think the opportunities are boundless these days. I've never been more bullish that we're not going to solve these problems. I just was at the University of Minnesota, a young woman's working on a market PhD dissertation on biodiversity. You know, this is what's going on. I was at Arizona State with 200 hydrologists that were talking about AWH. Anybody know what AWH is? I didn't. So there's 200 scientists, Coors Beer, Pepsi, atmospheric water harvesting to reduce the amount of money taken out of the Colorado River. I mean, we're at an age now between AI and the blockchain. I think enormous opportunity for all of you. The tokenization of carbon. You can trade tokenized stocks in hyperliquid in a Japanese over-the-counter exchange now. And just think of what can be done with monitoring and verification. When we had underground soil sequestration by no-till farmers, we had to send people out in the field. Right. We had to have Cargill. You got drones now and monitoring and AI. You can get to 99% compliance, you know, in almost everywhere. So I think as people which you have a natural endowment from, you don't have knowledge, and try to continue that attitude of being open to discovery and to have the joy of discovery. There's more opportunities now than we've ever seen. There's more tools that we have as economists. The universities here still produce the greatest leaders and minds of anywhere in the world. We are the envy of the world, and all of you have the power to affect change. There's food security, there's water security. We've got a healthcare system that's an outrage that spends close to 20% on GDP. Nobody's talking about faster cures and the economic benefits of them, or trying to trade places on an FDA approval line for things. We have tools like patents that could address orphan drugs by taking the 17 years and extending it to 30 years. We haven't gotten social objectives we have, nor policy tools that we have, and bigger technology. So just think about the goal and the tools would become apparent to you. I want to just say in closing, I use the word I a lot. The team was filled with the board, the Neil Eckerts of the world, the Paula who financed it and opened China, Mike McGregor, Dan, Fran, Ann. I'll put a prologue together. But most importantly, it's a team of willful-minded people set on a singular objective that did it. And I am confident that all of you will be part of affecting the change to make life a better place in this country. Joe, thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard. So as a reminder, there are copies of the book up front. We will reconvene next week. Aaliyah Hawk, the president of the Clean Economy Project, will be here. Thank you all for joining us. Have a good day and enjoy your week. Thank you, Richard. That was awesome.
You were fantastic.
That was fun.